I'm Rachel Horgan. Join me each episode as I sit down with a guest co-host covering the latest business stories in the Seattle area. We'll read the news so you don't have to. This is The Weekly. What is up, everyone? Welcome back again. As I mentioned in the last episode, I have a full YouTube video of my episode with Coral. If you want to check that out, it was pretty fun. And we talked all things VC firms and just kind of shooting the shit about news. So check that out. And then also a shameless plug, please go and if you haven't already rated the podcast on Apple or Spotify, please go do that. I've gotten a couple people reaching out to me and it's all because they're seeing that this is a popular podcast. So if you have a minute, shoot over those 5 stars. If it's not 5 stars, email me. The other update I have is that I'm going to be in Boston. I've never been, but I have a client that asked me to help with a conference. It's a different client, and it's just working on site for about 3 or 4 days. So I am trying to figure out what I want to do. If I want to record an episode in Boston, if you know somebody out there that would maybe be a good guest, let me know. I'm still trying to figure that out. I'm trying not to skip a week, though, so stay tuned. And the last thing I'll say before I introduce my guest is that we're not going to be covering it in today's episode, but there is a new PWHL team, so women's hockey, coming to Seattle. That news just broke yesterday. There's 8 teams in the PWHL, and Seattle has been chosen for the 8th team. So those are my updates. Sitting next to me is Julia Nagele, Senior Principal and Director of Design and Architecture here at HEWITT, which is a local architecture firm. Hello, Julia.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
Doing well. This isn't your first time on the podcast now, is it?
No, I think it was maybe a little bit over a year ago that
I think so.
I was a call-in guest. I wasn't live. This is my first live opportunity, so I'm looking forward to it.
Good. Yeah, you were phone a friend. It was my first time, I think, exploring that work. So I was doing an article on Skyglass, which we'll talk about. And I was like, maybe I should just have Julia say a few things. So I appreciate you doing that. And I'm glad we're getting to sit down for a full episode, all things architecture and design.
Absolutely.
So a little bit about you. You bring more than 20 years experience shaping complex urban environments. You've won awards for skyscrapers here in Seattle. You've served as an affiliate assistant professor at UW's College of Built Environments. And at some point, you ran your own interior design company. Is that right?
I did, yes.
I love it.
It all tracks.
Perfect. Well, before we get into the stories, tell me a little bit about why you got into architecture in the first place.
Yeah, wow. I kind of see it as a three-part formula, really. In my family, both immediate and extended, we had a lot of creative and clever people. And because of that, I think we had an inherent implicit value for creativity and cleverness. We also have a lot of strong women in my family. A number of them. In fact, my grandmother was an MD in 1939, and she taught at the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. And I got to live with her between high school and college for about 4 months while I was working in my uncle's architecture firm at the time. So we did have an architect in the family, but it was really about sort of this inherent value of clever people who were also engineers, industrial engineers.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I think of the 3-part formula is we have Scotch-Irish heritage. So storytelling is really important. And there have been any number of major holidays sitting around the table, hearing a number of stories where we blend fact with a little bit of fiction, just enough so that the story lands. So I think that those 3 elements combined made a career in architecture almost inevitable for me.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you for that. Another question I've been wanting to ask you is, what's your design pet peeve? Like when you walk into a building, why are you like, why did they put the door here? Like, what do you think about?
Yeah, it's a good question. One disclaimer is we never know really why a building looks the way that it does or how it came to be without having a deep sense of its background of how it was shaped. So as a casual bystander, it's really hard to know that. But let me flip the script just for a second and what really excites me about a building. What do I really sort of look forward to? And anytime I can walk into a building where there's a clear intentional expression from the door threshold to the sense of the space and the way the light sort of occupies that can make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, no different than art or poetry or music. And anytime those moments happen, that's what I find just so amazing about architecture. There was a moment when I was studying architecture in Barcelona. I was in the 1929 German pavilion designed by Mies van der Rohe, who's the godfather of minimalism. If you're not familiar with that project, it has a series of horizontal and vertical planes of onyx and granite and travertine, and it has really minimalist chrome-framed glass, and it just looks like a bunch of horizontal and vertical floating planes, really complex spaces. And I was sitting in the Barcelona chair, which you probably have seen as well, And a staff in the early morning, normal everyday experience, opened up a door in the chrome-plated glass. And that door wasn't a door with a frame on a hinge like you would see in a normal door, but it became just a seamless element once it was open, no different than other horizontal and vertical planes of the entire assemblage of the project. So it's almost like that creation of atom moment that you would see in the Sistine Chapel, that tension of seeing a common everyday door become this seamless expression in the overall concept was really, really powerful. It's probably everyday experience for this guy who was just working there, and it's stuck with me all of these years. But if you ask about pet peeve,
yes,
I'll
You'll answer.
I'll indulge.
Okay,
even with the disclaimer. And what doesn't bother me so much about is bad design; it's settled design.
Oh.
When a building accepts its lowest expectations, when it's sort of just working towards a baseline, good enough.
Yeah, there's like nothing interesting about it. It's just average building.
Absolutely. For me, what I sense then is there's this acceptance that there's some projects of architecture that deserve capital A architecture, capital A architecture expectations, and other projects that are something else. And when you flatten architecture into that dichotomy, you're flattening people's experiences, which that's what, for me, goes beyond pet peeve. And I do see that on occasion, and so for me that's sort of like the bigger picture. People can make mistakes. There's I get all kinds of stories of why buildings look the way they do and how they operate. But when we're not thinking about these everyday places where people live, workshop, and gather as something else other than the civic building, the museum, the stadium, whatever the case may be, that deserves this higher quality of expectations. I'm sort of very passionate about how can we bring those expectations into the everyday places.
Yeah, building with intention. I can tell you're passionate about this, and I like that. I'll tell you mine, which is when you go into a bathroom. This is more like a...
Oh, I love it. Let's hear it.
Not like your own personal bathroom, like a public bathroom in the stall, and there's no ledge to put like your phone or your purse or jacket or anything. There's nothing on the walls, and you're just like holding everything while you try
to set it up on maybe the tissue dispenser or something. There's no hook.
There's nothing. It's just flat against the wall. So that's a pet peeve. And then also when there's no, this is a classic one, but when there's no purse hooks at a bar,
right.
I think we're getting a lot better spot now where most places have it. But
well, the other challenge is too, when you're looking for the purse hook and you're putting your hand under a table, you just don't know what's under there.
That's true. It's true. And then it's like right on somebody else's knee. Yes.
Exactly.
Oh, the other one, I'm not going to say who it is, but there's a company I went to where they have these little huddle spots. So there's no door. It's like a small little room for two people and no door. But they put all of these huddle spots in a hallway that's by the bathroom. So people are walking by this hallway. So I tried to take a call there and people are like chit-chatting, because people stop outside the bathroom to say hello. So that was I thought about you when I saw that.
Adjacency issue.
That's what I meant. Okay, my last question before we get into the articles is your recent project is called Skyglass, and some people might know it as that crinkle cut building in South Lake Union, or the accordion shaped building, or as we talked about, the building that's looks like it's being tickled. This is a 33-story building completed at the end of 2023. And I will say I took an Uber yesterday, and I'm going to go ahead and guess that I brought this up about this podcast, and I said I was interviewing you. And I was like, she designed the building, and he goes, oh, I totally know what you're talking about. Like I showed him a picture. He goes, yeah. So it's just so cool that like a work that you've done, a random Uber driver is like, oh, I totally know that building. And that's incredible. So my question was going to be, what are you working on now? But yeah.
Right now, and we enjoy the nicknames as well. I think when I first came up with the idea of the micro-shifting floor plates of the tower, and there's all kinds of stories about why they're doing what they're doing and the reasons for that, but it does have a form to it, and that's really engaged. People are engaged with their environment, and I think that's a really important thing, even if it's sort of coming up with just nicknames.
Yeah.
But what we're working on now is we are working with the Low-Income Housing Institute. We were awarded a project to work on a site on 45th in the University District, so this would be supportive housing for 160 units, and it's a remnant site for the Sound Transit light rail station that was there, and it has a alley that needs to be vacated because the site was split into two. So to make it a developable piece of land, they have to redirect the alley. But that alley now has an opportunity to be more than just a utilitarian service corridor. It can have multiple functions. It can be reclaimed urban space, and that opportunity will be working through the design process. It also has an urban rest stop. So Lehigh had an urban rest stop in the U District prior, and various reasons it went away. But bringing it back
which is a place where anybody can go use the restroom,
public toilets,
shower,
and then there's health services,
Okay.
there's showers, there's laundry facilities, all kinds of accommodations and resources for homeless and just the general public alike. So it's a really exciting project that we've been doing some community outreach for, looking to get going in earnest this summer.
Yeah, I leave it to you to always be pushing the boundaries. I know that to be true. Okay, so we have 4 articles for you today. One is that a Belltown high-rise has sold for over $100 million. Next is Pioneer Square Hotel is going to be carbon positive. Then we'll talk about a developer that's going to start working on a Ballard mid-rise after 5 years of kind of stagnant. And the last one we'll talk about is landmark abuse. There's a bill going to the governor that we think is going to pass to end what's called landmark abuse. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. Julia, you had said when I gave you these stories, you said that all of these stories are important. Can you share a little bit more about why you felt like these were important for our audience?
Yeah, one, they're in my area of expertise,
True.
so I can talk about them. But secondly, I really love the collection of these stories because you're talking about the everyday places in the fabric of the city, the places where people live, workshop, and gather. And that's really, really important since for the first time in human history, in 2008, more people live in urban areas than rural areas, according to the UN.
Oh.
So if you lived before 2008, you lived on a planet where more people in rural areas. If you live after 2008, the trend has changed.
That is interesting. I did not know that.
And that trend is expected to continue to change. Mm-hmm. So if we're to address the big issues of the day, climate crisis, housing affordability, other various forms of inequality, that you have to prioritize these urban spaces, these everyday places where people live, work, and shop. Global real estate is a $280 trillion value, and 80% of it is where people live. And so if you think about the complexity of that, if you really want to move the needle, we have to prioritize these urban spaces. And these 4 stories are small stories that are all doing that. They're all contributing to this really important place. And so, talking about each one that have their own stories to tell is really valuable. And this next story, when we're talking particularly tall buildings, I think is uniquely valuable.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the Belltown high rise. It's an 18-story building called Sky at Belltown. It sold for $102.7 million. That's why I said just a little over $100 million. It's been around a while. It's been called different names, but the latest name is Sky at Belltown. The buyer is a Chicago-based property and investment firm called Waterton, and the seller is a Dallas-based company called Mill Creek Residential. It was last traded in 2013 for about $94 million, so I want to say relatively similar. I know there's like a couple $1 million difference, but in my head it feels sort of similar. And then Waterton said that they're going to upgrade some lighting fixtures, replace some appliances, update hallways, etc. So the story is that it sold. But I want to talk about high rises because, as you mentioned, you're in the business of tall buildings. Why are you drawn to skyscrapers in particular, and what's different when you approach a high rise versus kind of another size or smaller building?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can you imagine the 1949 an 18-story building in Belltown, what that might have looked like then?
I know.
It must have been amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so glad that it's getting new life and repurposed, and it's getting cared for, and it's seen as a really valuable asset to that part of Belltown. And that's next to Tilghman Place, which is, I think, a unique little pocket. If people aren't familiar with it, there's a Chief Seattle statue in Tilghman Place, and it's sort of this really shady plaza area with a lot of mature trees and retail along that edge. I know it. My first high-rise was along 4th and Denny, next to Tilghman Place, which is just across the way from Sky. But tall buildings have a unique role in this fabric of the city I just described. They're inherently sustainable. If the global real estate value of real estate is $280 trillion, seeing land as a natural resource and making the most of that natural resource by building up rather than out makes high-rises really valuable. Sharing walls makes them more energy efficient than otherwise, and they're usually compact forms. What I love about high-rises is they operate at multiple scales, so they have the ability to change the skyline and have the ability to sort of affect the overall image of the city. Imagine our city without the Space Needle, right? And in addition to that, they also have to sensitively situate themselves at the street level. And if you've noticed, as an example for Skyglass, the base of the building is completely different than the tower, right? Because it has to relate to that smaller context. It has to relate to the human scale. It has to sensitively situate itself at the street. And with tall buildings, oftentimes what's also challenging about them is they have severe economic demands. The amount of area you need for vertical circulation services, structure, and all of those has to just be the right ratio of the places, of the amount of square foot of where people live, what they're renting or what they're buying. And that's a really challenging thing. And sometimes the design effort can get lost in maintaining and monitoring that very sensitive, unique ratio because they're very expensive buildings. And so it can have a tendency to lend itself to boxy forms. You can shift your focus from really connecting in a meaningful way to the context of what we call the context or the nearby surrounding environment and be a structure that can move people no different than the little pavilion in Barcelona.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, speaking of tall buildings, I know I want to go back to Skyglass a little bit. You mentioned about the shifting plates. What kinds of things did you have to think about when you were trying to accomplish this super unique shape?
So with that idea, we had what we wanted to achieve. We didn't have a way to achieve it, right? We had a really savvy client who had an architectural background, understood the value versus the cost of things, understood the value of design, understood that having a distinct spatial experience in a unit was important, understanding that a deep connection to the surrounding environment was important, and understanding that if you can engage a tenant and be able to have them make choices about their living arrangements is what led to the technique of what we call micro-shifting these floor plates. All of the floor plates in Skyglass are identical. They're about 9,000 square feet. They're all the same size. They simply move 10 inches in one direction, 20 inches in another direction, one floor along a diagonal trajectory from northeast to southwest. 5 floors up, 5 floors back, and that's all it's doing. But what you're doing is you're changing the perimeter of the same unit. So now you have a variety of apartment sizes, a variety of price points, a variety of spatial experiences because of the tilted facades that it creates when you do this. And you engage a prospective tenant in refining what their living experience wants to be. How much do they want to pay for rent? What are the spatial qualities they really like? So instead of having 12 units per floor, we now have 120 to choose from. So it's like going into a supermarket, right? It's not about, do I want to buy or not buy? You're putting them into a choice mindset, sort of a retail psychology where you're able to say, well, what particular flavor or what particular brand do you want to buy?
Yeah,
and
it wasn't
really
designed
valuable.
for design's sake. It wasn't like, this will look cool. I think what's interesting about this is that you're tying it to financial benefit and also giving people more choices. Like it wasn't just do a cool thing to do a cool thing.
Yeah, there's no other way that would work. There's no, especially in private side real estate development, the concepts might have a cost premium to it. And this did because of the tilted facades, you'd have to have a curtain wall. But it has to have an outsized value, right? And so you have to, it's not good enough to show a fancy model or a pretty picture and say, this would be a great idea for these. You have to really prove that point out.
I'm guessing that's how you convince some of these stakeholders to go with this.
100%. We did not, the last thing, when we actually pitched that idea, the last thing that we wanted to do was show this as a form. We wanted to show, like, this is what it's doing, this is why it's doing it. And I think I showed a floor plan first. Like, this is the dumbest floor plan you could come up with. It's a rectangle, 4 corners, that's it. So optimized, so efficient. And well, what's the catch? And then we brought in a section model, just a corner of the model. It's sitting behind me, actually.
Yeah, those look cool.
And we brought in the model so they could stick their head into it and see it. And they could see how simple the moves were, the minimal moves, but the impact of the spatial experience, which is we identified really quickly as like a historic attic level apartment you might find in a European city, like a mansard roof attic level apartment with tilted facades in Paris.
Yeah.
And we saw that taking a little bit of the generic qualities out of that space to give it this relationship to the building that you're in had a lot of qualities to it that you could see in that model. And it was also really easy for them to see that we're not adding any concrete, we're not changing any floors, we're not turning any corners, we're just simply moving this floor plate out and back again, and you just have to wrap it when you do that. And then that's what the form ended up being.
I think it's smart. I mean, listen, we're in a day and age where you can't just come up with a good idea and expect everyone to be on board. Even though it is a good idea, you have to think about how you're presenting information to people. Is it in this PowerPoint? Are you coming up with a mock-up like you did? And I think that speaks to, how important that is, and how you really have to think about how you're communicating.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. It's not enough just to be on the right side of an issue and have favorable data.
Yeah. All right, we're going to move on to our next story, which is Pioneer Square Hotel is going to be carbon positive. It's called the Populous Hotel. It was formerly the Westland, and it'll be 120 guest rooms. I just texted, I think her title's Director of Sales, but Isabel over there, I asked her when exactly it's going to be opening because the article said late spring. She said there's going to be a soft opening May 22nd. So that is coming up soon. Reservations are open. And like I said, the article is talking about them being carbon positive, which will be the second building in the country after the first Populous Hotel in Denver. They're going to be using renewable electricity. They're going to plant a tree for every night stay. They're going to feature zero waste restaurants. That's just a couple things that they mentioned. It's also going to have Pioneer Square's first rooftop bar, which I'm excited about, called Fern. And they have a bunch of nature-inspired art, which was commissioned by some local artists and some international artists, which I thought was cool. So, Julia, for you, I want to talk about what's changed in design with regards to sustainability. I think we're seeing that be much, much more important these days. How do you approach designing a building differently now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and sustainability is a really complex and evolving, not one size fits all thing. Green building is also really complex, and with this particular project, Populous, the hotel project, achieving a sort of carbon positive, as they're describing it, it takes more than just viewing that building as being the green building, right? It has help, right? So what happens is they do what they can on site to achieve a certain level of certification for sustainable practices, but then they might have off-site mitigation, wind or solar farm, and I think that's a really great thing to where if you can view the complexity of sustainability that more than just that one building, I think that's actually required, right? When they say, think globally, act locally, I think it's think locally, in this case, think locally, act globally, right? Yeah. Sustainability is a global issue. Climate crisis is a global issue. So if you can achieve a higher level of sustainability on a project that you otherwise couldn't by, say taking photovoltaics that only have so much usefulness in our cloudy skies here, but outsourcing that to another place in the country to where that technology works a lot better, and you get a more sustainable building in Seattle, and you get then a more sustainable place in another part of the country. Like we have a project that just was completed called Liza. It's on East Lake Avenue across from Rogers Park. And it is a net positive project as well. That's
cool.
Yeah, it's a living building certified project. And so it's doing the same thing. It has photovoltaic arrays on the roof, but it's also has a wind farm. It's subsidized part of a wind farm in Texas. And so it takes a village kind of idea here, and that's what Populous is doing as well, which is fantastic. The other thing to know about sustainability is the city of Seattle and Washington State have been incrementally adjusting their performance requirements to meet the energy code every 3 years. So that eventually they can align themselves with the 2030 challenge, is where every new building will be carbon neutral by 2030. So the idea of what green building means, green building's going to go away. We're not going to have green building anymore. We're just going to call it building, right? It's just required.
Yeah.
And so I think those are really important parts. So all of the little things that are happening in Populous is great, and that's what it takes.
But is there an example like, nowadays we have much more windows, or like we're in public restrooms, we're doing the automatic hand soap. Like, what's something that maybe you used to do in a building and now you're like, we would never because it's not sustainable?
Well, windows is a really great point. As we elevate and increase the performance standards of buildings, it's usually a ratio of how much window you can put on the facade versus insulated wall. And to have buildings be more resilient in terms of insulation, heat, solar heat gain, and those kinds of things, less and less abilities for windows occur, or you have to have windows that are triple pane rather than double pane. And so I
know this well because I have floor-to-ceiling windows in my apartment, which I love, and my house is freezing all the time because they're single pane. So I feel like you're saving money on electricity because you've got all this natural light, but then I blast my heat all the time. So there's a struggle.
Right. So you want to make that envelope much more resilient to those kinds of situations. And so what's happening is it gets harder and harder to put put glazing in a project without additional costs like a higher performing window. At the same time, you want to have clean air exchanges. So you're making almost a refrigerator kind of insulated box and then poking a bunch of holes in it because you have to have air intake come in and exhaust come out. And residential buildings, especially at every unit, has a certain amount of exchange of air that has to go in and out of the building. And there's all kinds of rules of how far apart they have to be. So even with all of the increases of insulating your windows and your walls, you're still poking it full of holes and having to balance it all out. So there's a lot of science involved, but the big takeaway, let's say 2 code cycles ago, we could maybe achieve 45% of windows overall on our facades, and now it might be 38%, 35%, and it takes a lot of effort to do that with consultants who that's their only thing that they focus on, is to analyze the overall envelope of the entire building to see where we can do trade-offs. If we over-insulate here, can we have more windows there?
Wow. I didn't know anything about architecture, and now I'm realizing there's even more I don't know about it. So I appreciate you sharing some of that. The last thing I'll ask on this is, it's often been said it's too expensive to do sustainability, to buy a sustainable XYZ, whatever it is, it's too expensive. Do you have a counter to that? Do you agree with that? Or do you feel like, it all kind of comes out in the wash? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there is a premium.
Yeah.
And I think just like the approach to it is just like what we did at Skyglass, is that it's not enough to be on the right side of the issue and have favorable data. It's not enough to saying clients should do a sustainable building because it's the right thing to do. And they might agree with you. It is the right thing to do. But there's a business model, and what are they required to do? And that reality does hit. So the approach really needs to be is understand the cost and then also reflect upon what is the value. So it's not enough to say this is the right thing to do. You have to set up a concept which includes sustainability to make that happen. In fact, to make that happen, that's so frictionless that it doesn't seem like it's a decision at all. So it's no different than a design concept. If you wanted to have, if you want to achieve certain things, not only in design, but design that involves sustainability, it's the same thing in my opinion. So what it takes is you have to do that homework.
Yeah.
You have to say that you have to spell out what the pathway is going to be to achieve these things, what the additional costs are, and then describe what the value is. And you have to prove that there is real, tangible value to the business model in order to do this. Yeah,
you've mentioned this a couple of times, and I think it's relevant for people to hear in any industry, in that we can't just be looking at costs. Like, okay, product A or product B, A is cheaper, but maybe spending a little bit more. I know Dawn talked about this when talking about hot tubs, where he's like, you could get like a hot tub online or from Costco, but you're not getting as much value if you go somewhere else. And so I think it's good to differentiate those things.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, third article. We're talking about a developer is going to start working for this Ballard mid-rise apartment project. So Seattle's going to have a design review meeting, and this is for a 170-unit building in Ballard. They're basically turning these 7 single-family properties into a 6-story project with a corner commercial space. So they're turning these, what used to be family properties, into kind of building upwards. And I thought this part was interesting. They agreed to get an additional floor. They had to agree to save this tree, which I didn't realize that would be like part of the negotiations. And it's this huge Douglas fir that they're going to keep in the courtyard. And then as I kept reading, I saw that HEWITT, your company, is the landscape architect. So we've been talking a lot about buildings, but HEWITT also has a landscape division. So they'll be the landscape architect for this project. And then worth noting is that prior to this project, it was used for housing for refugees. So projects like these, they had mentioned, like you said, that there's a landscape architect, there's the interior designer, there's the contractor, there's the owners, there's all these people. So your world takes a lot of different groups coming together, and every project is a different group of people coming together. So how, being in the position of leadership, how do you work with so many kind of cooks in the kitchen? And along with that, this is a creative space. So there's a lot of, that's not right or wrong, but this is my preference. So how do you kind of manage all of that coming together?
Yeah, and over the years, I've learned teaching sort of helps that, because I'm coordinating with maybe 12 students through their quarter and doing their design work in 10-week quarter. We have 3 core values in the architecture studio: be smart, be creative, be principled.
Smart, creative, principled.
Right.
Okay.
And the reason we have these core values, they're a day-to-day guidance for us of how we operate, but it's also a pathway to success. And the core values expand to the consultant team. And we want to align ourselves that are motivated in the same way and would understand what our values are. To be smart is to command with authority your tasks and responsibilities. We all have different roles. We have all different responsibilities, but we need you to command with authority your own responsibilities. To be creative, if we're seeking to do innovative solutions to push the boundaries, you have to constantly be seeking out hard to find or unseen opportunity, value, or inspiration, right? And then to be principled, and this is maybe more at the heart of what collaboration is all about. It has language of treating others as you want to be treated, but it's also about being critical and challenging of the work that you do, right? And you have to have a certain strength to do that we're being critical and challenging of the work. We're not critical and challenging of the people. People who study architecture, landscape architecture, the whole process is project-based inquiry. They go in front of juries. They have to get critiqued. Constant feedback from people like myself.
I'm too weak for that.
That is the process. They pin their drawings up on the wall. They have their models on the table, and they get reviewed.
Absolutely not.
And so we want to reinforce that you need to have that ability to separate yourself from your work, and we extend that to the broader teams that we work on. Or work with, rather. Sorry.
Yeah. So speaking of working with different groups, there was an article I read where you quoted that you really enjoy working with people from other countries. Why is that, and kind of what perspective do those people from other countries bring?
What I really like about it is because we come from different parts of the world, because we have different customs, expectations, we can't just make assumptions about people. We can't fall into our default. And I found you have to really rely on the people, and in this case, relying on the local expertise, which is my studio. And I found what comes to the surface then isn't the expectations of who I am or what I should be good at or not good at, is your competency, your skills immediately come to the surface because that's all they have to rely on. And I sort of really love that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to stick kind of a little bit on this different perspectives topic. Another article was talking about how you kind of bring being part of the LGBTQ community into your work, and acknowledging that if you're part of that community or any kind of minority community, you do have to approach problems in a slightly different way, or approach the world in a different way. And I'll give my example before I ask you, but I'm in the events industry and I work a lot of weddings, and there's so much that's, the groom dances with his mom and the bride dances with the dad. And, the groom is at the altar first. And then, everything's so traditional, and obviously you can do whatever you want. But when you are a part of the queer community, I have to think, okay, what do I want to do? I guess should this happen? Should that happen? You can be so much more creative with that. Or for another example, who pays on a first date? Typically a guy would pay, but now that I'm dating women, it's like, okay, well, I don't know. Maybe I can make up my own rules. So these are small examples of that. When you're in a different community, the world is not set up for you, and you have to kind of think, how do I want to navigate? And that it allows you to be a little more creative. So how has that shown up for you in the design world?
Well, it's a great example, and it really gets to the heart of it, and it's really powerful. And I would have to agree with that. And I think what I learned really early on is moving through a world that wasn't built for me in mind, and I didn't view that as a hostile thing.
Yeah,
right. I just understood reality is the default setting wasn't necessarily for people like me. So my reaction is much like yours: is how do I reinterpret? How do I look at this from a different angle? How do I reconsider what will work for me? How do I make sense of it all for me, knowing that, again, I wasn't the default. And so that can be really liberating.
Yeah, because you don't have to play. You can go outside the box, because why not?
That's all you know.
Yeah.
Right. So, and whether, and just as you said as well, whether the diverse experience is shaped by orientation or race or class or whatever it can be really liberating. So early on, I learned to do this reinterpretation, whether it's anything in culture or society, even if it's a pop song, if they're singing about a sort of couple, it might be a straight couple. And I'm going to maybe not focus on that too much, but I might think of other parts of the song and really love that song, and constantly was doing that. So by the time I found art, by the time I studied design and architecture in school, that's exactly what they were asking me to do, is to reinterpret, reconsider what the expectations ought to be, to think about things creatively. So it was second nature by the time I was in school. And so I found that that was really, really helpful for me.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, that was the real key. I think you used the term superpower, right?
Yeah.
It's not to the detriment, it's to my benefit, my advantage.
I agree.
Right.
This is sort of related, but I watched the Avicii documentary recently. It's not new, but I just listened and watched it. And he was making like EDM music, and then he decided he wanted to change it up and have like live artists. And so he played this EDM festival, and he had the artists come out and like play, banjo and singing with him, which is so different. He got booed. And then that album went on to be wildly successful. But it was a good reminder of breaking the mold. Like EDM doesn't have to look like this. And now these songs are super fucking popular. So I love
And you have the strength to do it.
Yes. And he was willing to get booed and then be successful.
And I would also say, just to add to this point, that I also view like authenticity, living an authentic life. That's not the goal. It's the beginning.
Oh, I was like, it's not the goal.
It's not the goal. It's the beginning.
It's the beginning. Okay.
It's the beginning.
Yeah.
The real power then is once you acquired that for yourself, once you learned, I don't have to follow this framework. I don't have to follow this narrative. I don't have to follow anyone's narrative.
Yeah.
Even if it's a well-intentioned narrative by the community that we are called to belong to, right? And I think there's also power in that. So I think there's a snowball effect.
Totally.
That you can learn that these rules don't necessarily have to apply in all corners of your life. And I think that's just so much.
We're breaking rules.
There's so much fun in that.
It is. All right, we're going to move on to our last story.
Okay.
Which is that there's a bill that's going to end landmark abuse. And the House unanimously agreed. I'm shocked that anybody can unanimously agree on anything these days, but that's great. And the Senate had their approval, so that means it's going to the governor, which, we all kind of think that he's probably going to sign it. What it does is it requires the consent of an owner to nominate a property for landmark designation. As of right now, I guess anyone can nominate a property to be landmarked, and so it has slowed down development, and you'll obviously be able to talk to this, but now, and the other rule is that it has to be at least 40 years old before it was 25 years old. So the new bill is that it has to be 40 years old, and the owner has to nominate the property for landmark designation, not just any random person being like, that building's landmarked. Have you had to deal with landmarks, and how does it slow down the process of building? Yeah,
and I think I have T-shirts older than 25 years, so it seems to make sense from just a practical standpoint.
Yeah.
We were talking about buildings in 1999, 2000 as landmarks. But a couple of things about landmarks. So landmarks can be about structures that are architecturally significant, but it could also be about historic events or something significant that happened inside those buildings or people who are related to those buildings. So it has a broader significance than just the architectural significance. And yes, we have to deal with landmarks anytime we do a project in Pioneer Square. That's a historic district. So we have Gridiron Building, which is a triangular-shaped building next to the stadiums.
Oh yeah.
And that building was keeping the facades of a plumbing supply warehouse building. It was built in the early 20th century and putting an 11-story building, slipping an 11-story building in between it. And so that had to address a lot of sensitivity to maintain the historic character of that whole district, and has additional reviews that any project in that district has to go through.
They said on the article, it was like they were going through their 12th meeting with the landmark people. I worked at a hotel in San Diego. It was an old bank, and I don't know the exact rules, but I know they had to keep a certain percentage of the bank. And so when you had the meeting space, one of the boardrooms, it was an old bank vault door.
Right.
Which was cool. But so then there were a lot of other things they had to keep, but that was one example. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing about landmarks too is there's a whole process if your site or your building, your project is adjacent to a project or it's a building that's landmarked or across the street from a project. Now, it's not as intense often as a designation nomination process if the landmark structure is on your property, but it is additional steps and part of the permitting process that runs parallel with the other aspects of that project at that time.
Yeah.
And we've had to go through that all of the time.
So this is a good thing, right? We think this is a good thing.
I think this is a good thing.
Yeah. Okay. I think so too. Okay. Well, we're kind of coming up on the end of this. So your question is going to be a little bit different at the end of this episode because of the nature of what you do for work. But I want to know what your favorite piece of architecture is in the world. You've already mentioned a couple, but what is your favorite piece?
Well, I started to talk about the importance of all of these stories and the importance of cities, right? So I'll end on a story that why are cities really important. So prioritizing the places where people live, work, and shop is really important in cities. That's how I started this. When we end this, we can say, cities are really important because you can have these serendipitous connections and encounters of smart people with ideas that have other good ideas. I mean, there's just something about a city that makes it amazing. So I would also adjust the question, not necessarily my favorite piece of architecture, but a piece of architecture that profoundly changed my life.
Yes, that's a lot.
Right? And that, I guess you could describe as favorite. So in 1996 summer, I was studying architecture in Rome for the summer. And I had a history class in the Pantheon. So the Pantheon is an ancient, almost 2,000-year-old structure. It is a circular structure on the inside of 142 feet in diameter, and it's a dome structure. So the section of it is also 142 feet, and it has an open-air oculus at the top. If you've ever seen Angels and Demons, The Da Vinci Code, Tom Hanks. I haven't seen it,
but I know what you're talking about.
Right. So that building was in that movie. It's one of those buildings, right? It's the Pantheon. So Pantheon, it was a temple to all gods commissioned by Marcus Agrippa. So my history class lecture was under the oculus in that space. Afterwards, we had an assignment, which was to do a drawing, a very detailed drawing of a section of the interior. So I picked a bench and sat down next to the tomb of Raphael, the Renaissance masters, one of the big three, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Raphael. That Raphael is sitting next to me, and I'm drawing. When you draw, you are focused on what you're drawing more than your environment around you, and you can get lost in thought because that's a pretty intense experience. And that was broken when someone sat down next to me and said, "Are you an architect?" And I turned to her and I looked and I said, "Well, I'm an architecture student." And she was also a student studying law for the summer in Rome. And we had a really nice, great conversation. Her roommate approached and said, "Hey, it's time to move on. We need to do these other things." And we just parted ways. Okay. Have a nice life. And I'm walking back to my apartment that was along the Tiber River going, what's the matter with me? I had this really great conversation with another American student, like, "Hey, do you want to meet up? Do you want to, no phone number, nothing." And a few weeks later, I would say about 3 weeks later, our class traveled to Florence. And we got in late Friday night, had no sense of the city, woke up Saturday morning and wanted to see the city. So I wandered about by myself, and I'm wandering around Saturday morning through all the piazzas. And so all of the vendors are setting up with their tents, a lot like our farmers markets, except instead of produce, it's leather goods. And there's bags and backpacks.
Yeah,
this
I've
is
been there.
Florence.
Yes.
And I'm in one of these tents that are looking and rummaging around. Essentially, my orientation of the city turned into shopping.
Yeah.
And
as it does, yeah.
And I heard my name being called, and I turned around, and it was the same woman from the Pantheon.
No way.
And this time, her roommate didn't pull her away, and I didn't freeze up, and we've been together ever since. And her name's Anne.
Julia, I didn't know that's how you guys met.
And she's my wife.
Oh my God.
And that's the reason I live in Seattle. She was going to law school at Seattle U. She was from this area. I went back to America, finished up my last semester, packed up everything I owned, and moved to Seattle sight unseen.
Oh my gosh. And just speaks to it was so meant to be that you guys not only crossed paths happenstance once, but twice.
Yeah, for people who plan and design for a living, she's an attorney, she's completely planning and thinking about risk assessment, and I'm planning as a designer, that to have this sort of random thing happen that's completely seems like a fate thing kind of goes counter to what everything else that we're about.
True. And also I feel like the lesson here is shoot your shot, everybody, because you don't know.
It's power of cities.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It really is. So I don't think I have any other choice but to say that the Pantheon is my favorite building.
You have to. Yes, you have to. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. And thank you for hosting. We are here at HEWITT down on Lenora Street. And I'm going to take some pictures of all the little diagrams you have here. It's like miniature buildings. It's cute. So yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
This has been The Weekly with production assistance from Nick Patry. If you liked what you heard, rate us and write a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We love listener feedback, so if you have any story suggestions, comments, or complaints, email us at info@theweeklyseattle.com. Make sure to check back next Sunday for the latest local business news. We'll see you next time.